Hey everybody, it's John from 8 Worlds, and today I thought I would give you my top 5 SNES games, Super Nintendo games. Now keep in mind that these are not my definitive, these are the best games on SNES. It's not that list. These are the 5 games that were my personal favorites on the Super Nintendo, and some of that is simple nostalgia, some of that is the point in my life where I played these games, and so it's probably not going to be your top 5 list, and I can think of many games that should be on a top 5 list that aren't on this list, and some that shouldn't be on this list that are. With that being said, let's get started. Coming in at number 5 is Mario Paint. Now, the reason this little game is on here is because this is actually the first game I can ever remember playing. When I was a little kid, couldn't really understand platformers and things like that yet. Mario Paint just made a lot of sense. There was no winning, no losing. You just were creative, and that was it. You had your entire TV to draw pictures on, and you used a computer mouse, which admittedly was terrible to do this. But you could draw pictures on the TV, you could animate these little cartoons up to 9 frames of animation, and within these you had access to some classic Mario sprites and things like that. You could also compose music, but I was never very good at it. I am not that musically talented. Go on YouTube and search for some of the crazy stuff that people have made on this thing. It's pretty amazing. Now, I am hoping that Mario Paint gets remade for Wii U. Because, let's be honest, it's a system with a tablet, so you would actually be able to draw stuff much better than you could with the mouse. And that would just be an awesome game. I would love to see this come back as a franchise on Wii U. And you could do it on 3DS also. Next on our list is Aladdin. Now, Aladdin makes it onto a lot of great game lists, both the Genesis and the SNES version. Now, I grew up with Nintendos. I prefer the Super Nintendo version. I say that even after having played the Genesis version, which is good. Both versions of Aladdin are great games. The Super Nintendo one is just better. And for those of you who don't know, when Aladdin came out, there were 2 different video games made of it. One for the Genesis and one for the Super Nintendo, and then those versions were ported to other systems. And they were made by different companies. Now you may wonder, why didn't Disney just hire the same company to do both these games, like with Toy Story and things like that, where the Genesis version and the Super Nintendo version were, for all intents and purposes, the same game. Well, what happened was that Capcom had a deal with Disney that they would do all of their Nintendo games. And so, while one company made the Genesis game, Capcom made the Super Nintendo game. And so what happened is that we got 2 very, very, very different versions of Aladdin, but for some reason you can throw apples in both of them, which I always thought was a weird commonality. Like, they share nothing else in common, but you can throw apples in both of them. However, in the Genesis version, apples are frackin' deadly. In the Super Nintendo version, they just kind of stun people. But essentially, the game is just your basic platformer. You go through the level jumping on enemies' heads, level after level after level. There are a few where you're on the magic carpet, either just trying to collect points in sort of a bonus mission type thing, or trying to escape from the Cave of Wonders as lava comes flying in from behind you. All of this eventually culminating in a battle with Jafar that just frackin' breaks the poor Super Nintendo's frame rate because it's just so awesome. Next up, we have a game that probably doesn't deserve to be on any best of list. But this is the Super Nintendo version of Wing Commander. Now, Wing Commander, originally released for the PC on DOS, is a fantastic game. It's one of my favorite games of all time. And there were several console ports of that game, some better than others. And I think what is probably the worst version of the original Wing Commander was made for the Super Nintendo. Now, aesthetically, it's probably the most accurate to the original PC release. However, from a gameplay standpoint, not as much. Now, the original PC game had huge dogfights among many different spaceships and carriers, and it was so awesome. But the Super Nintendo, its hardware wasn't quite powerful enough to do all that. And so their answer was that they would have all those ships hovering off in distant space where the game didn't have to worry about them, and only one of them would attack you at a time. Now, what got this game onto this list is that this was the game that introduced me to Wing Commander. It was the first one I'd ever played, and as a kid I absolutely loved it, because there was such a deep story, and depending on what you did in the missions, it affected the story and the characters. If your wingman died in one of the missions, then he was out of the game for good, and you wouldn't know anything more that happened in his storyline. As a kid, I considered this to be a grown-up game. It was a game that my dad had got and that he played. And so one day I asked him, hey, am I allowed to play Wing Commander? He said yes. And so I played it, had no idea how to play because the controls were so complicated. Once again, this was a PC game, and so what took up an entire keyboard had to be condensed down into a D-pad, 4 face buttons, select, start, L, and R. And so oftentimes I would spend so much time trying to navigate the menu just to tell my wingman to attack the enemy that in the time it took me to do that, the enemy had shot me down. So yeah, not a great game, but it introduced me to a franchise that I still absolutely adore to this day. Next up is an easy one, and one that you'll probably find on most Super Nintendo top 5 lists, and that is Super Mario World. Anyone who knows me knows that Mario is my absolute favorite franchise of all time. No big surprise, being that I am obviously a Nintendo fanboy. And Super Mario World is what I would say probably the second best 2D Mario game. My absolute favorite 2D Mario game would be Super Mario Bros. 3 for the NES. But Super Mario World was the first Mario game I ever played. Well, the first Mario game besides Mario Paint. It was sort of the beginning of my love for Mario. And, you know, besides the nostalgic factor, it's just a wonderful, wonderful game. It kind of took what Super Mario Bros. 3 did with that world map and expanded it into this unified map where it was all one thing. I don't have a whole lot to say about it other than it's just really good and I like it. So there you go. And last, but certainly not least, my favorite SNES game of all time is Star Fox. This game took the SNES to its limits and then kept going. It was an incredible game. It was just unlike anything else I had ever played on the Super Nintendo. It is unlike anything else on the Super Nintendo. If there's anyone out there unfortunate enough not to know what Star Fox is, it is a rail-line shooter where you play as Fox McCloud, an R-Wing pilot, on his quest to save the Lilat system from the evil Emperor Andros, who would like to enslave it. The original Star Fox for the SNES was the first game to utilize the Super Effects chip. While the programmers were developing the game, they went to Nintendo and said, look, we've done everything we can to make this game look as good as it can on the Super Nintendo, but we can make it look better if we designed some new hardware for it. And so Nintendo said, yeah, go ahead. And so they created this chip called the Super FX chip that just kind of allowed the SNES to do some extra things, particularly in the realm of 3D. It's incredibly fun. It still holds up today. The frame rate does not. It never held up. And that's what I love about these early 3D games, is that people were so enamored by the fact that the game was in 3D that the fact that it was running at 2 frames per second didn't really seem to faze anybody. It was like, oh no, that's fine. Today, we worry so much if a game drops below 60 frames per second. We're like, this game sucks! Back then, it was like, I mean, even into the N64 era, you would have games just drop down to nothing whenever anything big happened. And everybody was like, yeah, it's fine. I mean, there's a big thing. We seem to be very understanding of video games back then. Not so much now. Star Fox was kind of inspired by a Game Boy game called X. If you look up YouTube videos of that, it looks very similar, but in wireframe. And so after that, they decided to make a Super Nintendo game with direct involvement of Nintendo. And then after this game came out, the people who made it went on to form Q Games, who, interestingly enough, were the company that ported Star Fox 64 to the 3DS. And so the 3DS version of Star Fox 64 is actually made by the same guys that made the original Star Fox on the Super Nintendo. So now you know. Anyway, guys, thanks for listening. This has been my list of my favorite Super Nintendo games. Be sure to like us on Facebook.com/8worldsnews, follow us on Twitter @8worlds, and check us out at 8worldsnews.blogspot.com. And go ahead and subscribe to the channel that you are currently watching. I won't give you a link to that, because I assume you are smart enough to find the subscribe button. If not, write me an email and I'll send help. Goodbye, Internet.
Come in, Cornelia.
This is Cornelia. Pepper speaking. Congratulations on a job well done.
Roger. I'm heading back to Cornelia.